For a lot of Christians, it really feels like there's only two options when it comes to churches. You have the Evangelical Church if you want to be Protestant, and you have the Catholic and Orthodox Church if you don't want to be Protestant. And I love the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, though I don't think they're a home for everybody. And I admire some of the things in the Evangelical Church, but personally, if I had to pick between the very flawed Evangelical Church and the very flawed Mainline Church, I would pick the very flawed Mainline Protestant churches any day of the week. So why am I a Mainline Protestant? Well, I suppose first I'll define what a Mainline Protestant is. It's widely debated, but mainline churches are just the historic Protestant churches that have drifted liberal over time. So from the American context, we have the Seven Sisters of Mainline Protestantism, and there's other churches that are considered to maybe be mainline Protestant, but these are widely agreed upon to be the Seven Sisters of Mainline Protestantism. So you have the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, and the American Baptist Association. Other churches are debated, like the Quaker Church. And from other countries' perspective, say if you're English, you have the Church of England, or if you're Scottish, you have the Church of Scotland. You're Canadian listening, you got the United Church of Canada and other churches too. But they're just the historic Protestant churches that have drifted liberal over time. So I would consider myself to be a Bible-believing Christian. So why would I go to a mainline Protestant church knowing that there is a lot of liberalism in these churches? Well, as I've said before, no church is perfect. And though mainline churches have a lot of flaws, and it's not that hard to find all the flaws, there's a lot of good mainline churches. And I think a lot of people overlook the good and just focus on the bad. And personally, I think that mainline churches are better than evangelical churches. I would rather be mainline Protestant than evangelical any day of the week. So these are 5 reasons why I'm mainline Protestant. Reason number 1 definitely has to be worship. Evangelical churches, they typically look like this. The church looks like a nightclub. The worship is just secular rock and roll, but watered down, and the word baby has been changed to Jesus, and the pastor's sermon sounds more like a TED Talk. And that is what worship is like inside the average evangelical church today. Meanwhile, inside a mainline church, the building is historic. And to be an historic building, it doesn't have to be like a Gothic cathedral. It can just be a simple white chapel with pure glass windows, and it can still be beautiful. Mainline churches, by and large, have very beautiful buildings, and there's a whole diversity. Some are like Gothic cathedrals. Others are a simple white country chapel, and there's all different churches in between, but these churches are all beautiful. So the buildings are very beautiful, and the worship is very beautiful. It's very historic. The hymns are very theologically rich. These hymns are usually hundreds of years old, and they're written by some of the best composers in Christian history. They're very beautiful, simple little hymns. And a really big thing is the Bible. Evangelical churches, they claim to be the Bible-believing churches, but there's not a lot of Bible in these churches. If you go to them, usually the only time you're hearing out of the Bible is when the pastor preaches. And that's usually the only time you're hearing out of the Bible in these churches. But in mainline churches, the Bible is literally everywhere. It's inside the worship. A lot of the hymns outright quote scripture. A decent chunk of the time, psalms are actually sung in mainline churches. The Bible commands us to sing the psalms, but they're not usually doing that in evangelical churches, but they do that inside mainline churches. So this, scripture is usually inside the worship. Scripture is also read from the liturgy. You're going to have a reading from the Old Testament and from the New Testament. And if you hear a strange noise, it happens to be my cat. She's right at my feet right now, so that would explain a weird noise you're hearing. But as I was saying, the Bible, literally, the mainline church, the Bible is everywhere. It's read inside the liturgy, so you're going to have a reading from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this is a form of real presence. So when the Bible is read in church, this is actually a form of real presence. Christ is present when the scriptures are read, and this is a form of the real presence. And the Bible was intended to be read in church. It's good to read the Bible alone, but we're receiving a means of grace when the scriptures are read aloud. And in mainline churches, the Bible is everywhere. It's inside the worship, as I said before. It's read inside the church. Of course, when the pastor preaches his or her sermon, you're going to have the scriptures there too. And and the scriptures inside the prayer. And another reason I'm mainline is the prayer. You have a lot of prayer in mainline churches. A lot of evangelical churches, they don't have a single moment of prayer. It's just a sermon. Maybe there's an altar call prayer. But in mainline churches, you have a lot of prayer. You have prayers for the world. You have prayers for people's souls. You have prayers for the sick. And of course, you're going to have a lot of scriptural prayer. The Lord's Prayer is prayed. A lot of evangelical churches, you will not find the Lord's Prayer prayed. but the Bible commands us, to pray the Lord's Prayer. And a lot of, prayers inside mainline churches, they have scripture in them. And, you're just not getting that in a lot of evangelical prayer. So there's a lot of prayer in mainline churches. And I think it's a lot of evangelical churches, they put such a strong emphasis on who your worship band is and who your pastor is. In mainline churches, that matters a lot less. It matters a lot less who your worship leaders are. You sometimes have a choir. You sometimes don't have a choir. Sometimes you'll have an organist. But you don't really have a worship band, at least it's central to the church usually. Now, some mainline churches do have contemporary worship, but usually in mainline churches, they do have contemporary worship. They also have a dual service, so they'll also have a traditional service. But the worship band matters a lot less in a mainline church because you usually don't have one. And also the pastor. Now, pastors are important in mainline churches. A lot of people will criticize saying, mainline, they sometimes have liberal pastors, and that's true. But the pastor is a lot less important in a mainline church. For instance, the sermon is not 45 minutes long. A sermon is only about 15 to 20 minutes long. And the pastor is just a lot less important. Now, of course, pastors are important. I don't want to understate that. But in a lot of evangelical churches, we have celebrity pastors and stuff. You don't really have a lot of celebrity mainline pastors because pastors just aren't as important. Now, of course, pastors matter, but, the role of the pastor is very different. And another way, I talked about how we're fed by the word, but we're also fed by the sacraments. And evangelical churches typically do not have sacraments. The big sacrament missing in most evangelical churches is communion. Evangelical churches tend to teach that communion is just a symbol. They do not consecrate the bread or the wine, meaning it does not become the body and blood of Christ. And the traditional Christian teaching is that somehow, some way, that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. There's different understandings. There's spiritual presence, which means it isn't like physically the body and blood of Christ, but he's present nonetheless. And there's more other interpretations as well. I've already talked about this inside a video called "Are We Eating Jesus?" But evangelical churches don't tend to believe in communion, meaning you're not going to receive communion in an evangelical church usually. But in mainline churches, you are receiving communion because they believe in the real presence. And a lot of mainline churches do weekly communion. Also, a lot of them do monthly communion. And usually in a mainline church, you're not going to get communion less than once a month. Some do it like every 2 weeks, but mainline churches tend to be frequent. They frequently do communion. Many mainline churches do weekly communion, even like multiple times a Sunday communion. So a lot of churches do communion regularly in mainline churches. So you're going to be fed the sacraments. And the Eucharist is very important because, you are what you eat, and you're eating Christ's body and you're drinking his blood. You're becoming more like Christ. And, we are receiving the Eucharist in a mainline church. So even if your pastor isn't, even if you don't see eye to eye in your pastor on everything, your pastor is still he or she is still administering the word, and he's still administering the sacraments. And to those of you who don't believe women can be pastors, most mainline pastors are actually men. So actually you don't have to worry about female pastors in a lot of cases. So, you're receiving the sacraments and you're receiving the word, which is a very big deal. So that's the first thing, worship. Worship is more historic. In fact, in a lot of evangelical churches, and this is my theory, because they don't have the word usually and they do not have the sacraments, that's why I think they're so emotional. A lot of evangelical worship, it's very emotional. They play really loud instruments. They have very, emotional sermons. They have a lot of, they have all these lights and these smoke machines. It's all about emotion. And that's because they don't have the word of the sacraments. They're not being fed. They're hungry. So their souls are hungry because they're not being fed the word and they're not being fed the sacraments. They're starving themselves. So in the mainline churches, you may not always see eye to eye with your pastor, but even if your pastor isn't the greatest, you're still going to be fed because you're going to receive the words and you're going to receive the sacrament. And that's what really matters, that you're going to be fed spiritually. Inside an evangelical church, your pastor may be great, but you're going to miss out on a lot of the word and you're going to miss out entirely on the Eucharist. So go to a mainline church because you're going to have the Bible a lot more and you're going to have the Eucharist. So for me, the biggest thing is worship. Mainline churches objectively just have better worship. Even if the pastor isn't always the best in a mainline church, they have much better worship and you're going to get fed. Reason number 2 has got to be charity work. Mainline churches do more charity work. For instance, Redeemed Zoomer made this wonderful point how, how many non-denominational churches have founded a hospital? But you know how many mainline churches have founded a hospital? All of them have. A bunch of mainline churches founded hospitals. A lot of hospitals were founded by mainline churches. And it's not just hospitals, universities, and a lot of charities. Mainline churches, even small mainline churches. Like I was at a local Evangelical Lutheran church. It wasn't even 10 people there, and they were still collecting what little money they had, and they were putting it into a jar to help with charity. Evangelical churches just wouldn't do that usually. Mainline churches, they have a very strong emphasis on charity. They do a lot of charity work. They make charity institutions like hospitals. They, of course, help people with schools. Mainline churches have founded a bunch of schools, seminaries, colleges, and lower grade schools. So they have founded a lot of schools. Mainline churches do a lot of charity work. For instance, a lot of mainline churches have soup kitchens or other ways to feed the poor. I'm not saying evangelical churches don't do charity, but at least for me, my experience with a lot of evangelical churches, like they have an event every few months, a big charity event. But mainline churches, they're always doing charity consistently. They always have something charity going, like all the time. That's a very big deal in mainline churches. They're always doing charity work. And that's another way of the real presence. I talked about how we're receiving Jesus in the word read, how we're receiving Jesus in communion, but we're also receiving Jesus when we are helped the least of these. He's very clear about this in Matthew 25. When we help the least of these, we are receiving Christ. He's present in that way. And mainline churches, you're helping the poor and you're helping the sick and you're helping the least of these all the time. So you're also receiving the least of these. You're receiving Jesus in that way too. And mainline churches do a lot of charity work. And that's a really big benefit of being mainline. They do a lot of charity work. So that's another really big thing I like about mainline churches. And if mainline churches were to all go away, there would be a big hole in the community I just don't think evangelical churches would fill, because mainline churches, for all their flaws, do a lot to help the poor and the sick. And that's something that I think is really great about mainline churches. Reason number 3 is they're ecumenical. Now, I know the word ecumenical has been distorted because it's come to mean like, working with all the different world religions. But what the term originally meant was greater unity among Christians. And mainline churches are much better at Christian unity. For instance, most mainline churches, we go to the Seven Sisters, a lot of mainline churches were founded by church mergers. So a lot of evangelical churches tend to break apart all the time. But mainline churches tend to unite. So, for instance, take the PCUSA. The PCUSA is a merger of the Northern Presbyterian Church and the Southern Presbyterian Church. Take the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That's a merger of 3 Lutheran churches. And we can go even further. The United Church of Christ is a merger of like 4 different denominations of multiple different Christian traditions, and they all merge together in the name of Christian unity. But it's not just mainline churches are products of mergers between different Christian churches. Mainline churches also do a lot of ecumenical work with each other. For instance, most of them have common mission statements, which means that, say, Pastor Bob is an evangelical Lutheran. If he wants, Pastor Bob can be a United Church of Christ minister. And most of these churches will share pastors between each other. And they tend to do a lot of, unity work. In my experience with mainline churches, they pretty much all work as one institution. This really is the truth. Mainline churches, a lot of the pastors will go to the same seminaries. They'll swap out between different churches. Mainline churches tend to work, and the worship's all very similar. The liturgy is very similar. Mainline churches tend pretty much to work as one big church. There's different mainline churches, but in reality, it's more like just one big mainline church. They tend to work like that. And I've noticed with mainline Protestant Christians that a lot of them will swap between denominations no problem. So not all of them, some do have denominational loyalty, but a lot of them be like, oh, I'm a United Church of Christ, but I moved and now I'm Episcopalian, and then I moved again, now I'm United Methodist. So a lot of mainline Protestants are a lot more ecumenical. And they're not just ecumenical with just each other, they're also ecumenical with other Christians. For instance, they'll do a lot of ecumenical work with Catholics, a lot of ecumenical work with Orthodox Christians, and a lot of ecumenical work with really any Christian church they can. They do a lot of ecumenical work, and it's true sometimes I do think they go a little bit too far with their ecumenical work. I do think that I'm not against talking with other faiths, I'm not really against ecumenical gatherings per se, but I do think that mainline churches often do take it too far. Once again, I'm not a liberal, so I do disagree with some of the more liberal policies of mainline churches. But I really do appreciate the ecumenical nature of mainline churches. And this next point kind of builds on that, and that is that they're big tents. Mainline churches are big tents. We often strawman mainline churches as just being super liberal. This is the church with, the gay pride flag and all that. But the mainline churches are actually a lot more diverse than that. Some mainline churches are so conservative they don't even ordain women. Other mainline churches are so liberal that, they don't even believe Jesus is God, or don't even know if there is a God. But most mainline churches are somewhere in between. A lot of mainline churches are just moderate. Most mainline churches are moderate. A lot of them are not very liberal. And of course, some are. But mainline churches, they're a big tent. In fact, a lot of mainline churches are what we would call purple churches. And this is something you're not really going to see inside the evangelical world, where it's that you have liberal people and conservative people, and they go to church together. In mainline churches, it's not uncommon to see like Calvinists, Arminians, Universalists, and all sorts of different people all go to the same church, and that's just normal in mainline churches. There's a lot of freedom of belief in mainline churches. Of course, sometimes it does go too far. I do think there's problems with like ministers that don't believe in the deity of Christ and all that, but most mainline Christians are still Christian. They would still affirm the basics of the Nicene Creed. And there's a lot. Really, one of the key differences between mainline churches and evangelical churches is evangelical churches tend to prioritize purity, and mainline churches tend to prioritize unity. So mainline churches are a lot more willing to be unified, even if everybody doesn't fully agree on everything. But in evangelical churches, they're a lot more. In a mainline church, it matters a lot more that everyone gets along, and even if they don't fully agree on everything, then everybody agrees on everything. Say inside an evangelical church. So I mean, there's a big benefit to being the big tent, and that is that mainline churches are very diverse. A lot of mainline churches are actually very conservative. There are a lot of conservative mainline churches and moderate mainline churches, and they coexist with the more liberal ones. Take the United Church of Christ, for instance. It really is true with the United Church of Christ that if you've been to one United Church of Christ, you've really only been to one United Church of Christ. It's a very diverse denomination, and that's true of all the mainline churches. They're all very diverse. But once again, there's also a lot of unity. Mainline churches all share the same liturgy and very similar worship. In mainline churches, there's a lot of unity and like the basic stuff. So most mainline Christians, would affirm the basics of the Christian faith, and they all worship together. But they're allowing for a lot greater freedom than you get inside an evangelical church. And I personally am a believer inside a big tent. I like big tents. I think there's a lot of them. And of course, I think there's downsides to big tents. I'm not saying they're perfect, but I'd rather be inside a big tent church than a small tent church. And finally, and that is that mainline churches are a lot less fear-based. A lot of evangelical churches, it's very fear-based, and even Catholic churches too, even Orthodox churches, there's a lot of fear. Fear of the world, and of course, I don't think we should embrace everything in the world, but there's a lot of fear of the outside world. There's a lot of fear of, not getting everything right. A lot of people are so afraid to be wrong about even the tiniest of issues. And of course, the elephant in the room is hell. A lot of Christians are very afraid of hell. But in mainline churches, they're not so fear-based. You won't hear that much about hellfire sermons. Even very conservative mainline churches don't tend to talk about hell at all. And that's, of course, something as a biblical universalist, though I do believe in a hell. I don't believe in the hell most churches are teaching. I really appreciate a church that is fairly biblically solid, but does not mention a hell at all. Even very conservative mainline churches, you will not hear much talk about hell. You will never hear an altar call. You will never hear, will never hear people trying to scare you into getting saved. You're never going to be told that, you're going to hell for disagreeing with me on this tiniest thing. And there's just a lot less fear. Mainline Christians aren't like paranoid that Jesus is coming back every 5 minutes, even though, of course, I do believe that he'll come back one day. Mainline Christians aren't as paranoid. In fact, mainline churches are some of the last Christians that are really actually like diverse on political opinions. A lot of mainline Christians, they can be conservative on one matter and liberal on another. That's something that's really becoming increasingly rare. And mainline churches, you're still going to find that kind of thing. And there's just a lot less fear in mainline churches. Mainline Protestants are a lot less fear-based. Now, of course, does that mean that sometimes you have a lot of problems in mainline churches? Absolutely. But there's a lot less fear in the mainline churches. A lot less people are afraid. And I do think that's the big reason why mainline has declined so much, and that is that they don't preach absolute certainty on everything. Inside a mainline church, you're not going to get, we're the truth, we're absolutely right about everything. We can give you all the answers about everything. In mainline churches, it's we don't have all the answers, and sometimes you got to figure things out for yourself. And somebody else might not fully agree with you on everything, but we can still come together as Christians. And I think that's a big reason why mainline churches are not so popular. That is that they make you think. Not all the answers are just spoon-fed to you. You actually have to think about your religion. You can't just have everything told to you. And I think that's a big reason why mainline churches aren't so popular. So that's 5 reasons why I'm mainline Protestant. The worship is more historic and I think much more biblical. They do a lot of charity work. They're ecumenical with fellow Christians. There are big tent denominations, and they're not fear-based. And that's, for me, is why I'm mainline Protestant. And, a lot of people are like, well, I'm not a liberal. So how do I not find a liberal mainline Protestant church? Well, actually, our friends at the Operation Reconquista have actually made a big map, and you go to their website, of conservative mainline churches throughout the United States and Europe and other countries as well. And also, at least when it comes to the United Church of Christ, and I know the UCC has this reputation for being hyper liberal. Actually, the United Church of Christ, only 1/3 of congregations are open and affirming, meaning 2/3 are not. Now, I have experienced that some churches are not registered as open and affirming, but actually are. But I'd be willing to bet that about half of United Church of Christ congregations are actually not liberal. So at least with the United Church of Christ, you can actually just look at their website. They have a church finder, and you can see if a church is liberal or not, and just visit your local mainline church. By and large, a rural mainline church is not going to be liberal. But I mean, there are a lot of mainline churches that are not liberal. Just visit your local mainline church. Look at look at the sermons. A lot of them have online stuff, and the beauty of the mainline churches is because they're mostly old people. You can have a big influence. So, for instance, if you don't like something about a church, well, get involved and you can fix it. I'm all about reforming Christianity, and I do think that we can reform Christianity. I always say we preach Christ and they will come. And I think that if you preach Christ and you act like Christ and you live like Christ, I think I think you're just gonna have a lot of success. And when I was talking about not being so fear based, what I love about mainline churches is I think they keep it simple. They have a lot of issues, but mainline churches, you're gonna hear, we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and body, and we love our neighbors, we love ourselves, and that's what mainline churches preach. And mainline churches really do stick to that. Now, are these churches perfect? Lord, no. These things have so many issues. Mainline churches are very, very, very flawed institutions. They're like a good car, like a car built 50 years ago. It worked good for a long time, but the old girl, she's got some issues now. She's she's been all used up, and there's a lot of issues with this car. But it's still, at its core, it's a good car, though it has a lot of issues. And it's kind of, mainline churches are like that. They're a good car, a lot of mileage, but there's still a lot of good in them. It just needs some fixing. And mainline churches, they have a lot of issues. I'll be the first to admit that. But there's a lot of good mainline churches I think a lot of people overlook. And I would like to end, there's no such thing as a perfect denomination. Every church is very flawed. I'd like to say, some churches are following the Bible better on this, and other churches are following the Bible better on this issue. And I think mainline churches, I think they do a very good job at generally preaching a very loving God and, the accepting and loving God we see in the cross. But they often don't teach enough about sin and about God's judgment. I do think the evangelical churches teach too much about God's judgment, but, I would rather have a church that is a little bit too soft than a church that is too legalistic. That's my honest opinion. I just think mainline churches are better. Please check out your local mainline church. God bless. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Turn on that notification, man. And y'all just have a good day. God bless. And remember, Christ will conquer.